Traoré expels Trump. You stole $800 million from Africa. The room went completely silent. We dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers by the end of the month. Subscribe, leave a like, and be part of this dream too. The marble halls of the United Nations headquarters in New York buzzed with anticipation. A special emergency summit had been called, ostensibly to discuss trade imbalances and African debt relief. But behind closed doors, murmurs circled about something far more explosive. Delegates from over 50 nations gathered under the golden dome of the main chamber. At the center of it all stood two polarizing figures: Donald J. Trump, former President of the United States, and Ibrahim Traoré, the defiant young leader of Burkina Faso. The air was electric. Cameras flashed. Some saw it as a photo opportunity. Others sensed a reckoning was about to begin. Trump was already on stage, flanked by American advisors and global finance executives. He smiled confidently, throwing out jokes and compliments, especially toward African nations he once claimed he wanted to help. His tone, however, veiled a condescension familiar to many in the room. Ibrahim Traoré entered moments later. Calm, composed, dressed in his military uniform. He did not shake Trump's hand. He simply nodded once and took his seat. That one gesture sent waves through the room. Everyone knew this wasn't just about economics. It was about history. As opening speeches began, Traoré remained quiet, his eyes fixed on Trump. The American delegation presented charts, economic projections, and new partnerships promising African development. But Traoré had come prepared. In his hand was a thin black folder, its contents unknown to all but him and two of his most trusted ministers. Every line on his face carried the weight of generations robbed and silenced. When his name was called, he didn't rise slowly. He stood like a storm about to break, and silence fell instantly. He stepped to the podium and placed the black folder before the microphone. Then, with a voice that cut through the air like a blade, he spoke. Before we talk about the future, we must talk about the theft. The room froze. Mr. Trump, he continued, this isn't about aid. This is about $800 million stolen from Africa. Under your watch, through puppet banks, fake contracts, and blood pipelines. Gasps erupted. Trump's smirk vanished. The entire room fell dead silent. Traoré opened the folder, and history was about to be rewritten. With the black folder now open on the podium, President Ibrahim Traoré began to slowly reveal its contents, page by page. Each sheet he held up wasn't a theory. It was a documented transaction, a signed agreement, a scanned receipt bearing signatures of multinational banks and officials tied to Western governments. There were offshore account numbers, shell corporations, and memoranda of understanding crafted to look like aid packages but cleverly written to extract wealth. Here, he said, holding up a contract bearing the World Bank seal, is the clause that allowed $120 million in gold reserves to leave Burkina Faso without a single tax dollar returning to our people. Donald Trump shifted in his seat. His expression had gone from amusement to visible discomfort. Murmurs turned to whispers. The French delegation exchanged worried glances. The World Bank representatives looked pale. Cameras from Al Jazeera and RT zoomed in as Traoré flipped to a document dated 2 years before Trump's presidency, but renewed in 2019, linking the export of rare earth minerals from Africa to private American military contractors. You talk of democracy, Traoré said coldly, yet you made private deals with corporations that installed dictators, robbed our land, and paid mercenaries to silence those who resisted. Then, Traoré turned to Trump directly. Mr. Trump, in 2019, a shipment of gold worth $800 million left Ghana and passed through Burkina Faso en route to Switzerland. It never arrived. Our records show it was intercepted, diverted by a private firm with direct ties to one of your family's business fronts. I have the manifest. I have the names. I have the recordings. Gasps filled the hall. Trump stood up abruptly, face red with rage, and slammed his hand on the table. Lies! Baseless lies from a nobody, he shouted. But Traoré didn't flinch. He simply raised one final piece of paper, an internal memo from a U.S. diplomatic officer, leaked by a whistleblower. It read, "The president insists Traoré must be silenced. He knows too much about the operation. Move funds discreetly." The room was no longer silent. It was stunned. Reporters scrambled. Delegates whispered furiously. Trump, red-faced and seething, looked around the room, realized he was alone, and stormed out. As the doors slammed behind him, Traoré quietly looked into the cameras and said, "Africa will no longer kneel." The world would never be the same. The footage of Donald Trump storming out of the international summit exploded across global media within minutes. Major outlets like BBC, Al Jazeera, and CNN ran headlines not about the conference's original agenda, but about the confrontation between the former U.S. president and Burkina Faso's defiant leader. Hashtags like #TraorèStrump and #AfricaRises trended for days. For many Africans across the continent and in the diaspora, it was more than a moment of truth, it was vindication. They had always suspected hidden hands behind their nation's poverty. Now they had proof, and it came from a man who dared to speak while others bowed. In the U.S., conservative commentators scrambled to defend Trump. Fox News called the documents unverified, while others accused Traoré of staging the event for political theater. But their noise couldn't undo what had been broadcast. Independent journalists, human rights lawyers, and financial analysts began dissecting the documents Traoré revealed. Every claim checked out. One investigative group traced the $800 million in gold through a complex web of transactions, confirming its disappearance in Swiss accounts held by shell companies traced to Trump's associates. The evidence was damning, and now public. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, spontaneous rallies broke out. People waved flags, chanted Traoré's name, and held up placards that read, "Bring our wealth home, and no more puppets." Leaders from Mali, Guinea, and even Congo reached out to express solidarity. In Nigeria, President Tinubu, who had once mocked Traoré, remained silent, watching his popularity slip as his people questioned where their gold had gone. In Paris, Emmanuel Macron's cabinet was reportedly in emergency meetings as French banks feared being named next. Traoré, however, stayed calm. He didn't call for revenge or riots. Instead, he returned home and held a televised address. "This is not a war against the West," he said. "This is a reckoning. We are not children begging for charity. We are heirs of stolen empires. And we are here to collect." His speech, translated into more than 50 languages, was replayed in schools, villages, newsrooms, and even parliaments. The world had underestimated him. But now they were forced to listen, and the balance of power had begun to tilt. In Washington, D.C., the aftermath of Traoré's revelation sent tremors through the political establishment. The U.S. Senate convened an emergency closed-door session, while former President Trump remained silent, his legal team scrambling to contain the narrative. Reporters camped outside Trump Tower and Mar-a-Lago, hungry for a response, but none came. What did come were subpoenas. A bipartisan committee began investigating the alleged transfer of African gold into Trump-linked shell corporations, and whispers of indictments began circling through Capitol Hill like wildfire. In Africa, however, Traoré's words had become more than a headline. They had become a rallying cry. From Lagos to Nairobi, students organized marches demanding the return of their nation's stolen resources. In Kinshasa, young artists painted murals of Traoré standing above golden chains being shattered. In Johannesburg, economists hosted forums analyzing the secret agreements their governments had signed under pressure from Western institutions. For the first time in decades, the African people weren't just reacting, they were organizing. France found itself cornered. Leaked memos from the Élysée Palace showed panic as more African leaders began canceling diplomatic visits and demanding audits of French-controlled gold reserves. President Macron went on live TV, insisting France had no knowledge of the U.S. transactions, but few believed him. Protesters in Dakar and Bamako set fire to French flags outside embassies, chanting, "Traoré! Traoré!" The president of Mali declared an emergency economic summit with Burkina Faso and Guinea, aimed at launching a new African currency backed by gold. Meanwhile, Ibrahim Traoré remained unshaken. He declined interviews with major networks, instead choosing to speak through Burkina Faso's state television, where he outlined his next steps. "We are creating a committee of independent African auditors," he announced. "They will trace not just our gold, but the resources of every African nation. And when we find where they went, we will knock on the door, together." The room erupted in applause, and across the continent, millions stood up, not out of anger, but out of awakening. Africa's stolen century was ending. The reclamation had begun. 3 days after his historic speech, Ibrahim Traoré stood in the National Assembly, flanked by delegates from 20 African nations. The atmosphere was electric. Flags of Angola, Ghana, Senegal, and more lined the hall. Cameras from Al Jazeera, the BBC, and even reluctant Western media broadcast the event live. "This is not just about Burkina Faso," Traoré began, voice steady. "This is about justice. This is about dignity. And it begins today." Behind him, a digital screen flickered on, displaying the names of offshore companies linked to former colonial governments, and the exact tonnage of African gold transferred to them. The African Independent Audit Committee, a new Pan-African body funded solely by member states, was launched with investigative teams made up of forensic economists, international lawyers, and blockchain analysts. Their mission: trace every ounce of gold exported over the last 50 years, expose the routes, and name the beneficiaries. It was a colossal undertaking, and the West knew it. Within 48 hours, financial pressure mounted. 3 French banks quietly froze transactions linked to the Burkinabe government. The World Bank issued a vague warning of market destabilization. But Traoré smiled. "They panic because they know we are right," he told his cabinet. "And we will not stop." Meanwhile, public support surged. In Accra, Ghana's parliament passed a resolution demanding the repatriation of its gold reserves held in the UK. In Ethiopia, journalists uncovered a Swiss vault storing Ethiopian gold since 1972, allegedly for safekeeping. Suddenly, the story wasn't just Traoré's. It was everyone's. People began calling it the Golden Awakening. In universities across the continent, students studied not just economics but resource sovereignty. A renaissance was blooming, and this time it wasn't being funded or filtered by Europe. Back in the West, attempts to discredit Traoré intensified. Western outlets called him a populist strongman, and former leaders labeled his movement irresponsible nationalism. But the old tactics failed. Even diaspora Africans in Paris and New York rallied in solidarity. And when leaked emails revealed that a U.S. law firm had drafted contracts tying African exports to Western hedge funds, the tide turned further. "We are done being your mine," Traoré declared at another press conference. "Africa is no longer for sale." With every word, the world's power balance tilted further. The White House hotline rang at 3:47 a.m. Washington time. On the other end was a voice calm and unshaken: President Ibrahim Traoré himself. Joe Biden, tired from an emergency briefing, listened carefully as Traoré laid out terms. "We are not asking for aid. We are demanding a return," Traoré said. $800 million in African gold is held within your borders. We have the documents. And the world is watching. Biden, flanked by his chief of staff and secretary of state, asked for time. "You don't have time," Traoré replied, then hung up. The room fell silent. Within hours, the U.S. Treasury summoned its legal teams, while the Pentagon flagged Traoré's rising popularity as a national security concern. Intelligence memos labeled him the most influential African figure since Mandela. But Traoré wasn't interested in titles. In Ouagadougou, he stood before a sea of supporters holding signs that read, "We want our gold, and no more chains." That same evening, he released a 12-minute video titled "The Truth About Your Wealth," with multilingual subtitles. It went viral. 125 million views in 24 hours. The backlash against US and European silence was swift and global. In Paris, students stormed the French National Archives demanding access to colonial-era gold contracts. In Brussels, protesters held up bars of painted cardboard labeled African blood gold. Meanwhile, Traoré's next move stunned even his allies. He announced a Truth and Transfer Commission, inviting former colonizers to publicly admit resource exploitation and arrange reparative transfers. France refused. The UK ignored it. But surprisingly, Norway's foreign minister requested a seat. Africa was dictating the terms now, and the West didn't know how to respond. The African Union convened an emergency summit in Nairobi. For the first time in decades, member nations agreed unanimously. They would no longer trade gold with any country that refused transparency on historical holdings. Ghana, Nigeria, and South Africa withdrew gold from Swiss vaults. Even nations once hesitant, like Egypt and Morocco, signed the charter. Traoré, standing at the summit's podium, raised his hand and declared, "This isn't about revenge, it's about repair. This is how we heal. This is how we rise." The crowd erupted. The age of silent theft was over. The United Nations General Assembly was packed that morning. Cameras from every major network were rolling, anticipating another tense showdown between the African delegation and Western powers. Delegates murmured as President Ibrahim Traoré entered, flanked by a united African bloc. His presence now carried undeniable weight. A few rows ahead sat Donald Trump, attending as a guest speaker for a Western Development Summit scheduled later that day. When Traoré took the podium, silence spread like a wave across the hall. He began calmly, addressing the assembly in fluent French, English, and more. "Today, I do not speak only as the president of Burkina Faso, but as a son of a continent that was robbed in daylight. 4 decades, leaders stood here in suits while our people died poor, their resources enriching cities that have never known thirst or hunger." He paused, then added, "I have proof that $800 million worth of African gold was transferred illegally to foreign accounts, with one signature traced back to your own hand, Mr. Trump." The room gasped. Trump, visibly rattled, stood up and shouted, "That's a lie. I did more for Africa than anyone else." His voice echoed in the chamber, but Traoré did not flinch. "You stole from us," Traoré said, eyes fixed on him. "And today, we revoke your presence in this room. Africa no longer recognizes your right to speak on our future." The assembly erupted into murmurs, then cheers from the African and Latin American delegations. A motion was filed instantly. Moments later, security approached Trump and asked him to leave. For the first time in UN history, a former U.S. president was expelled from the chamber. Outside, thousands cheered as the news broke across the globe. Headlines read, "Trump removed by Global South, Traoré rises," and "The New Voice of Justice." Traoré stepped down from the podium not as a regional leader, but as the man who had dared to confront the most powerful voices on earth, and silence them with truth. That night, as Trump's team scrambled to recover in damage control, the world witnessed a shift. The old order had been publicly challenged, and the future was no longer theirs to write alone. The expulsion sent shockwaves through every diplomatic channel. U.S. media outlets scrambled to defend Trump, labeling the incident a publicity stunt, and accusing Traoré of staging a theatrical moment. But the facts were indisputable. Documents presented to the UN had been verified by independent auditors and traced back to offshore accounts linked to resource extraction firms with ties to Trump's former administration. The world had seen it happen live. There was no denying what Traoré had exposed. Africa's narrative was no longer controlled by foreign lenses. It was being told by its own leaders. In Burkina Faso, citizens flooded the streets in celebration. The national radio broadcast Traoré's speech on repeat, while murals of him confronting Trump began appearing across Ouagadougou. Students in Ghana, Nigeria, and South Africa held solidarity events, chanting, "Africa is not for sale." Across the continent, people no longer saw Traoré as just a president. He had become a symbol. A leader who didn't beg for loans or validation, but who exposed corruption in real time, in front of the very architects of that corruption. At the African Union headquarters, leaders convened an emergency summit. Inspired by Traoré's courage, several presidents agreed to begin auditing their own mineral exports and resource contracts. The phrase, sovereignty audit, was coined, signaling the beginning of a continent-wide review of deals signed over the last 50 years. Western governments, caught off guard, scrambled to send envoys to reaffirm partnerships, but doors were now being closed. The global economic game had shifted, and Africa was no longer the pawn. Meanwhile, Trump retreated to private meetings with his remaining allies. His pride wounded, he attempted to frame the event as an attack on American greatness. But in reality, his credibility had suffered a fatal blow. Analysts on every major network debated the long-term impact of his expulsion, while African media declared, "The Lion of Burkina has roared," and the world trembled. Traoré had not just spoken truth to power. He had seized the global microphone and dared the world to listen. Traoré's actions had set off a chain reaction. In Senegal, Mali, and Chad, citizens demanded transparency on foreign mining contracts. Leaked reports began circulating online, revealing decades of backdoor agreements where billions of dollars in natural resources had been siphoned from African soil under the guise of development aid. Suddenly, populations were connecting dots. How their gold built foreign palaces, how their oil funded foreign wars, and how their silence had been purchased with poverty. Youth movements surged. Universities launched conferences under banners like Africa Reclaims, with students dissecting the economic models forced upon them by the IMF and World Bank. From Lusaka to Nairobi, there was a collective refusal to accept the past as inevitable. Young Africans were now asking, if Traoré could expose a president in front of the world, what could we do in our own communities? The spark had turned into a fire, and it spread faster than anyone anticipated. World leaders tried to contain the fallout. France's foreign minister issued a carefully worded statement emphasizing mutual respect and continued partnership, but it was met with scoffs. China, seizing the moment, approached African leaders with proposals that emphasized sovereignty and equal trade. Yet Traoré warned his peers, "We are not shifting masters. We are becoming our own." His message was clear: Africa would no longer trade one leash for another. In private, Trump seethed. He had planned a return to power, hoping to rally international support and project dominance. But Traoré had shattered that illusion. The world had seen an African leader not only defy him, but silence him. It wasn't just a diplomatic defeat, it was a cultural and historical reset. And in that silence, a new sound echoed, the rising voice of a continent reclaiming itself. The clip of Traoré's final words, "You stole $800 million from Africa," played on global news cycles for days. But what no one expected was the impact it would have back home in the United States. Congressional hearings were suddenly flooded with requests for audits on U.S. foreign aid to African nations. Whistleblowers came forward, revealing offshore accounts, forged development reports, and misallocated funds disguised as humanitarian grants. The system had been cracked, and Traoré had been the hammer. Meanwhile, in Africa, something extraordinary was unfolding. For the first time in decades, leaders who had remained neutral or passive began meeting publicly to discuss a new African monetary system, one not tied to the CFA franc or other colonial currencies. In a historic summit held in Ouagadougou, presidents, ministers, and economists gathered under a single banner, "Our gold, our future." And at the head of the table sat Traoré, not as a dictator, but as a symbol of accountability, sovereignty, and a continent rising. Trump, silenced and politically wounded, retreated from the spotlight. His supporters tried to spin the event as a deep fake or international setup, but the world had already made up its mind. Even his political rivals in America praised Traoré's courage, noting that exposing global corruption had transcended ideology. In Africa, murals of Traoré began appearing on school walls, city buildings, and currency notes, his silhouette beside slogans of liberation. And so, the man once underestimated by global elites had done more than humiliate a former president. He had shattered a centuries-old illusion that Africa was weak, poor, or voiceless. In front of cameras, microphones, and the judgment of the world, Traoré gave Africa something no colonizer ever could: its voice back. And in that roaring silence that followed, the world was forced to listen. Forever. If you made it this far, comment where you're watching from and let us know if the story of justice moved you.